All right, well, welcome back to the Adding Style with CSS Jumpstart. I'm Christopher Harrison, that is Helen Zhang. And in the last couple of modules, we sort of focused in, we focused in on kind of the basics of, hey, you know, here's CSS, and then we got a little bit more advanced, and we took a look at how to go in and highlight and find all sorts of different sections. But we didn't really focus a whole lot on how to lay out the page. I mean, if you took a look at my page example, I mean, it was still relatively kind of ugly as far as layouts and all of that went. So it'd be nice if we talked about page layout. What do you say?
Yeah. So a lot of you have actually also been asking questions about this, saying, you know, like, it's great. We want to know how to, especially, you know, change text size, but how am I supposed to change the width and height of something? How am I supposed to lay out the page? At the end of the day, that's a very important part in actually making your site look good.
Stop using tables.
Yeah, so we're going to talk about a couple of things. We're going to talk about how to position your elements on the page. Mm-hmm. So, you know, how to make something stay at the top of the page, how to make elements sit next to each other nicely, how to center things, you know, how to position those elements, as well as what goes into sort of the position of an element. What is, not to get too philosophical here, but what is an element? You know, what is it, seriously, yeah. What is it composed of? Which is the box model. You know, an element is not simply the content, it's also the stuff around the content.
So an element isn't just an element. There's more to it than
yes.
just simply just that individual tag.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
And we're also going to talk about how elements can interact with each other and sort of disrupt each other on a page, and how we can solve those issues.
Okay.
So at the end of the slide, or at the end of this module, I'm hoping to get a page like this. So, you know, it's not beautiful, but it's a rough estimate of what a landing page, what a pretty modern day landing page would look like. And we're going to basically position all these elements that I've put in here, and get from this to this.
Perfect. I love it.
Great. So first, we should talk about the display property. I mean, this really gets an element to actually display on a page. And there's a lot of different HTML elements, as you guys well know. And there are a couple types. Two main types, really. The first is a block level element, and those are the typical elements that you're thinking of: paragraphs, divs, forms, headings, you know, anything that really takes up an entire row for itself on the page. Mm-hmm. There are also then inline elements like spans, links. You know, if you're using the B tag for bolding something, that's an inline element, and they don't take up an entire page. You can think of these roughly as, you know, things that could go inside of a paragraph or inside of something else. Okay. And I think that's an easy shortcut to think about it. Not exactly, but that gets you into the right idea. And you can also display things not only as block or as inline. You can also completely hide an element from the page using display none. And that's a bit different from something else that you might have heard about called visibility none. Visibility none basically takes an element and hides it, but still basically has a placeholder size for it on the page. Display none actually hides the element altogether. So, you know, if you had three things and you hit the middle one, then it would basically collapse into two. Whereas if you use visibility none, you would basically have one and then a blank space and then three. That makes sense. So
display none completely disappears. Visibility, there's nothing that's going to be there, but it's just going to be white space, if you will, that's right there.
Yeah. So something funny I saw was, you know, it's basically like a ninja. It's there, but you don't see it. Or an invisibility cloak.
Okay. I like it. I like it.
Yeah.
One little thing that's worth highlighting, though, is, especially for people who are doing server side, is that HTML is still sent down to the client. So if somebody went in and viewed the source, they'd still be able to see the text behind the scenes. They're just not seeing it on the browser screen. Yeah,
it's just a good way to sort of dynamically hide elements on the page if you need to do that. You know, for instance, we'll get into this later on, but if you're resizing a page, like based on screen size, it's very helpful there. And then there's a...
No, go ahead.
Is that confusing?
No.
Okay,
nope.
Great. And there's the last thing
I just always have this confused look on my face. It's just me.
Okay, just checking. But the last thing that could be a little bit confusing is that there's an inline block type element. So a block type element, typically needs a whole row for itself. An inline block element basically allows you to collapse a bunch of block elements onto the same row. So, for example, if you had like 3 cards that you wanted to show on the same page, each in a little div, you would be able to do that by setting them to inline blocks rather than just block elements.
Okay.
So actually, if we go to my example here, you can see that these are all inline blocks, but without styling, they're just block elements. They're just sitting one behind each other.
So those are all contained inside of div tags, and so the div tags are just going to go top to bottom there.
Yeah, and I can show you that in the F12 tools. You'll see, they're just like very basic boxes, and they don't have an inline block element like inline block property like these do. Let me open this up. Yeah, you'll see they're shown as display inline block.
Okay.
And you can also see that if you, let me disable this, they automatically go back to being one behind another.
All right. So that normal block is just going to go down, down, down. That inline block they're still separate elements, but they're not automatically going to go down to the next line, so to speak.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
It's a pretty common use case. Yeah? Sometimes you don't want everything to go one single file down the page. Sometimes you just want 2 things next to each other.
Right.
And that makes it easy, or makes it possible even. Something else that we should talk about, the second most important thing in having something show up on the page is the position property. So the display, makes sure it shows up, but the position actually talks about where it is. Or how to determine where it is, shall I say. So the first type is, there's a couple of types for this. The first is static, and that's basically the default, completely unformatted way of having a position. So it'll just sit exactly where it should be on the page by default. The second is relative. So that is relative to where its default position would be on a page. So for instance, if something is if something is a first element, so if it was, if you had an element that was, how do I do this? Never mind. Basically,
Go ahead.
Basically, you had an element in the top right corner of something, and you want to shift that down a little bit. Shift it down by 100 pixels or maybe 10% based on the page. You would use the relative because you're basically trying to just move the element relative to where its original place would be. The next one is fixed, and that's just relative to the browser window. And this is especially useful for headers, for instance. You've seen it on a lot of web pages probably, that move with you as you scroll. And the last is an absolutely placed element. These, I think, are less commonly used, and they can kind of be confusing. Absolute elements are put basically exactly where you position it. So if you give it, I want it to be from the top of the page 100 pixels, from the left of the page 100 pixels, it'll just be right there and nothing else will move it. It doesn't listen to any of the other elements. Whereas a lot of these other ones, they relate to other things. Like for example, the fixed is relative to the browser window, and relative position is relative to where its default place is. So let me show you an example of that.
Yeah, go in and see it. That's always sort of the best way.
Yeah. So for instance, this header right here is a fixed element, right? So when you're moving down the page, it's fixed relative to the browser window.
Nice. So you didn't do any JavaScript or anything fancy like that. You just simply said fixed.
Yeah. In fact, if you look at my HTML code, there's absolutely no JavaScript on this page because I just want to make clear that everything that happens here is based purely on CSS. I don't have any absolutely placed elements on this page because it didn't actually seem like it was necessary to have something just randomly in this in the upper left-hand corner or something like that on the page. Plus, those would actually scroll with you. So as you're moving past it, it would just go away. And absolutely positioned elements are also just not very flexible, obviously, because you're putting them in one place and they won't necessarily move or shift according to the layout in a pleasant way. So now that we sort of have the groundwork for how all these elements are placed. Let's actually go through and place our sort of mismatched elements on our other page.
Okay, so we'll start with that ugly page and actually prettify it.
Yeah, exactly. You'll see in the header here, this is in a list. We'll, of course, make those in line. We'll make all of this work. But let's start by doing some of our position and element stuff. So this is a base CSS file that I have for that page. As you can see, a lot of these things are actually styled a little bit. Like there are these boxes. I changed the background color. These aren't important to positioning, so I just put that in there. So we're not starting with a completely blank page. That I tried it. I tried to put that in the demo. That actually does take forever.
Yeah. And you had to get rid of that serif font.
Of course. It's the first thing you have to do. Although, like what Chris had before, something that's nice to put here is in case they don't have Arial. I don't really know people who won't have Arial. You can put sans serif just to have a fallback.
Arial, Verdana, they're basically always there.
Yeah.
Yeah.
They're the good go-tos. Okay, so something we haven't so first we're going to position our header on the page. And something that we haven't really talked about yet is width and height. And these are pretty self-explanatory elements of there's pretty self-explanatory properties of an element. The width, determines how wide it is, and height determines how tall it is. And so you see that I have put a couple of different positions in here. For the header, I stretch it to 100%, and that is 100% basically of what its parent element is. But because header, you can see in my HTML file here, it is sitting right here. It doesn't really have a parent element besides body, and body is just 100% of the page, obviously. That'll automatically stretch to 100% of that page.
Okay, so just to sort of reiterate that, that width at 100% is based on the parent element. It's not based on the browser window. And it just so happens that this is inside of body, so that's why it's 100% of the entire window, because body is the entire window.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, if you want, we can go through and we can show this to be, if we change body to be with 50%, and this would just, or I guess we should do 500 pixels to make that a bit more clear.
Ah, I like that. Okay.
And we refresh this. Yeah, you'll see that the entire body is now 500 pixels, and then, but the header block is still 100% of the width here.
Okay.
So you'll see here, body is just that 500 pixels across, and then so is header though, because it's 100% of that.
I like it.
Yeah, so let's go through and undo this. We don't want, that kind of a page. And we're also setting height here. We're setting height in pixels. So as Christopher talked about before, there are a bunch of ways that you could set these values. And in here, setting element sizes as well as text sizes, you can use things like EM to make it relative to the size of text. I'm just going pixels here because that makes sense. You want your header to be at the top of the page at a fixed height. So I'm just setting it to that. And what I'm going to do now is, going back to positioning, I'm going to set its position to actually be fixed. So it sits at the top of the page.
Okay.
So let's see what happens now.
So you just made one little change there. You just simply said fixed.
Yeah. I simply said fixed for the position. And now if you see, when I start scrolling, that element stays at the top of the page. Now it's worth noting that there's some spacing issues. We're going to get to that in the box model part.
Okay.
So don't worry about that for now.
All right.
We're also going to change some of the elements in our header, because you'll see we don't want our header to be, or our header links to be vertical. We want them to be horizontal on the page, like this.
Okay.
So we can do that by simply making these list items inline instead of block, like they are by default. And so what we can basically do for that is we can say display inline. And once we save that, when we refresh here, they'll of course be in a line.
Okay. All right. So by default it was block, so boom, boom, boom down the list, and now inline it's all going to be horizontal.
Exactly. So yeah, inline just allows these elements to sit next to each other. It's not. it's not necessary to use inline block for elements like this, where they're still small and they could be part of like I said before, something that could be part of a paragraph. Like I said before, I just use inline. But we will use inline block for a couple of other things. So I'm just tabbing all over the place here. You'll see in this page, for instance, we have these two elements. We have this sort of side text here and this image being on the same line. And you can achieve that using inline block.
Okay.
We also have all of these sort of cards here of all the things that we theoretically teach in each of our modules. I left them blank. I was going to put some lorem ipsum in there, but then it just seemed like we were teaching you rubbish, so I left them blank for now. But yeah, these are also inline block. And actually, one nice thing about inline block is that they automatically sort of they automatically will reseat themselves based on your viewport size or your browser. So so those kind of adapt depending on your display.
Okay.
So we're going to set two things to inline block. We're going to set three things to inline block. We're going to set the side text and this image to inline block, and we're also going to set all of these boxes to inline block.
Okay.
So in Visual Studio, you'll see, okay, let me show you the code for this first. You'll see that the banner text and the banner text is that large header that we had, and the side text and the CSS image are what we want side by side. So that's within the hero block, and it's important to note that when these are inline, they're inline relative to their parent. And our boxes are not actually IDs, but they're classes. Since they're all the same style, it just makes sense to put them in a class rather than giving them all individual IDs and styling each of those. So I'm going to go through and I'm going to set this to display inline block. That'll set all the boxes, and we're also going to set our, where is it? Side text display to inline block. And our CSS image to display inline block. And so now, when we refresh this page, you'll see that they're on the same line again. Now, there are some issues with the positioning. For instance, this transform and transitions, because it has a two-line title, it's up a little bit. And this side text is sort of, it's aligned to the bottom rather than the top with this image, which is what we want. And that is mostly because of how the CSS box model works. Okay. Which is something that we're going to talk about. Why is that happening?
Right.
And the CSS box model basically describes what are all the components of an element on the page. It's not just the content, right? It's also all the things that go around it. So you can think of the CSS box model as actually just a box. There's some content in the middle, and then between the content and the border, which you can set to a certain style, you could have the padding. So everything that's sort of inside here is inside the element, and then outside of this is the margin, which is basically the space that you want other elements to stay away from you on. So a good way to think about this is, for instance, if you set the background of this entire element, it would go sort of like this in sort of color. It would go from the padding on, right?
Okay.
So that would encompass all of the color, but the margin would stay clear because that's sort of viewed as outside of the border of it. Now, so the margin is a space outside of an element. The border is the visible border around the element. And the padding is a space within the element, but outside of the actual content that you have inside of it. This is kind of a little bit confusing because when you think about when you think about the size of a box, you don't really think about the size of it, including like some space around it. You're really thinking about the size of of a box, right? So if you had a cardboard box and you're measuring the side of it, you would be measuring from the outside of the box on one side to the outside of the box on the other side. You wouldn't necessarily go inside it and just like measure how much the box can store. That doesn't really make sense as a way of measuring. And so there's something called the box sizing attribute that really changes this and makes that much easier. So basically, instead you can change this to border box so that it will actually measure your when you're doing width, it'll measure from here to here, and that'll be sort of the width of the box, and which I think makes sense when you're talking intuitively about an element. And then here to here, so as I don't really know how to use zoom it, so I'm just drawing squares as lines, or drawing boxes as lines.
That's good.
Hope that's okay with you guys. So yeah, so now if you're using the box sizing as border box, this would be the height, and this would be the width, instead of before where it would encompass other things.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
All right.
And the box sizing, that's one of those new attributes that we talked about. So
that's a CSS3 thing.
Yeah, it's a CSS3 thing. So so you set it to be. So it does actually need a vendor prefix specifically for Mozilla Firefox. So you're going to actually need two things. You're going to need a border box. You're going to need to set box sizing, and you're also going to set -moz -box sizing.
Unfortunately, Visual Studio does that for you.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
But those are just some of the quirks that we talked about with CSS implementation, and this is one of the places where it does come up. So, so where are the places that we need to actually set box sizing on our page? Well, a good example is actually right here in the header. So let's say we want our text here to not be we want our text to be more centered vertically in our header. So to do that, maybe we can add in some padding on top to kind of push the element down a little bit. Now, what would that look like?
That's a good question. What would that look like?
Yeah, so you would set that in header, and you basically set some padding to basically push elements down inside of it, down a little bit. And you can do padding. You can do padding top to just basically set the top of that to, I'm going to say, 10 pixels.
By the way, while you're there, can I ask you a real quick side question? Because there's a question in the Q&A about the z-index.
Okay. Yeah, the z-index is, okay. So I'll explain why we need it first, and I think that would make a lot more sense.
Yep.
So on this page, you'll see as we're scrolling down,
everything else goes behind.
Yeah, everything is going behind this. And by default, things are at z-index 1. By setting the z-index to a higher number, you're basically saying this element is in front of all the other elements. If we set it to something like -1, then all the other elements would kind of go in front of it, which doesn't make sense as a fixed header, because then you can't really see it anymore. Things are getting in the way. So that's why I'm setting the z-index.
Okay.
Yeah.
Perfect.
And I just set it to 10. So I like to set things by order of magnitude, not by like 1, 2, or 3. I think it makes things a lot more clear, and that way you can have some granularity if you need it.
Yep.
So yeah, I'm setting this padding top to 10 pixels for this unfinished page. And you'll see that if I refresh the page, I do have more of a padding on top, but it also pushes down the size. It also increases the size of this top header a little bit. And if we look in our F12 tools and we look at the header, we can actually see its layout size here. And you'll see that there's some padding here on top, in addition to the 70 pixels, right? And that sort of, and that increases in like a weird way, so that this entire thing becomes 80 pixels instead of 70. And we don't want that. We want it to be 70 forever. So the way that you can fix that is, like I said, you can set box sizing. So I'll just do box sizing, border box, and for our Mozilla, we'll just go in and do this. And that basically sets the border box specifically for Mozilla. The box sizing thing works the box sizing works out of the box for all the other browsers.
Out of the box? Box sizing, out of the box?
Haha. Unintentional pun, but I'm still going to take credit for it.
By the way, do this for me real quick. Hit a carriage return and type in box sizing again. And one of the things that everybody will notice, hit backspace, one more. Okay, you're going to have to delete it and bring it back up again. I just want the IntelliSense back up.
Okay.
The box. So you'll notice on box sizing that there's like a little pair of scissors that's next to that. So that's a snippet. So with that highlighted, if you hit tab twice, it'll automatically put in all of the different vendor-specific versions that you need, so that way you don't have to remember each one of them. So Visual Studio can actually do that for you.
That's really cool. I didn't know that.
Yep. Yeah.
And you can just change these elements directly.
Exactly. Yep.
It does have the WebKit box sizing here, but WebKit has now rolled that into their standards, so you don't need it anymore.
Right.
Unless you do want to target, older versions, in which case that's decent practice. Yeah.
Yeah. So yeah. But we'll go with that for now.
Okay. So we're going to save this, and now when you go and refresh this page, you'll see that this has again become 70 pixels. 10 pixels isn't a huge difference, so you might not be able to see it too clearly, but here, if I select this element, you can see now, it's kind of pushed in that element size a little bit to account for the padding.
Okay.
So now instead of it being 80 from accounting for padding, now it's 70 even accounting for padding. And
that's on the F12 Tools, that layout tab, and that's showing you the full box, that way you can see the sizing of the box and how everything's coming together.
Yeah.
That's really cool.
Yeah, these can be really finicky, so it's nice to actually see all these things. Yep. And it's especially nice to have this, to have the element selection tool to be able to actually select these. No.
Yep.
Yeah, so we want to set the box sizing for that. And we also want to set and we don't need to set the box sizing for everything, but we might need to set the padding for some things. So I don't know if you guys can have noticed, but there's actually supposed to be, this huge title line here, a banner text that says add style with CSS Jumpstart. And that's completely hidden here. It's hidden behind the nav bar.
That's a problem.
Yeah, that is a problem. And the way I'm going to fix that is I'm basically just going to, in the hero block, which is comprised of basically everything in this blue box, I'm going to set some padding on top to basically push the elements inside down a little bit.
Okay.
Oh, actually, I want to show you guys how to set padding for basically all four sides at the same time.
Okay.
So instead of doing padding top, you could just simply do padding, and you can put in 4 values.
Okay.
And the values basically go top, right, bottom, left in that order.
So starting from the top, going clockwise.
Exactly.
So top right, bottom left.
Yeah, and so you put in 4 values. And for this, since I'm only setting top, I'm going to set 70, which is the size of the header, and then I'm going to do 0, 0, 0. I don't bother putting pixels in for the other ones because 0 is the same basically on any scale. It's nothing. It's worth noting, right?
I suppose 0 is 0.
Yeah. But if you do just omit the other numbers, then that basically gives you a 70 pixel padding all around. So on all 4 sides, it'll give you 70. Whereas if you set all each side separately, it'll know that you want all of them to be different.
Perfect.
In our case, it won't matter too much, but I'm just going to set it like this because that makes sense to me.
And now we can see add style with CSS.
Yeah, exactly. And now that's sort of pushed everything else down on the page, which is exactly what we're looking for. Okay, so now now the elements are sort of in the right positions on the page, but they're not aligned in the way that we want them to be,
right.
Or they're not floated on the side of the page like this that we want them to be. Mm-hmm. So we're going to talk about that next. What happens after you size elements? They still need to interact with each other, mm-hmm. right? And so the first thing that we're going to talk about is the float property. This is probably the most commonly used property for anchoring elements on a page. This horizontally anchors an element basically on its row. So if you float elements to the left, it'll stay on the left side, and if you float elements to the right, it's going to stick basically onto the right side. And it also allows other elements to flow around the page. So I have an example down here of basically what a blue box floated onto the right would be. You'll see that the text is, able to flow sort of around it. And this was the original use case for float. I mean, when CSS first started, HTML was also intended to be, basically a document, right?
Right.
So it was intended to basically float images around and let text go around this. But since then, float has been sort of co-opted to do other things. And those other things do include basically anchoring an element on its row. So one of the elements that we want to anchor is our large CSS3 badge. We want to anchor that onto the right like this. I know this isn't really pretty, but it does give you a good indication of what floating something onto the right would be.
Absolutely.
You'll also notice that there's some space right here between it and the right side. I'm going to show you what that would look like basically if I didn't have the margin there. Yeah, so this is my image, and right now I'm giving it a 10% margin to the right. That way it scales with the page size. If I didn't have that, it would just go directly to the right.
I gotcha.
So we're going to set a couple of things. We're going to set its float, and we're also going to give it a little margin so it doesn't float just on the edge. So in here, we'll say float right. And we're also going to do margin right 10%. Whoa, 10%. I need to find percent. Okay, great. And similarly, we want to set the left margin for our text to not be exactly on the left edge of the page, but have a little bit of buffer. So I'm going to do margin left on this, and I'm going to do 10% as well, so it looks a little centered. And now, if we refresh our sort of demo, it'll go like this. Whoa.
All right.
What happened?
Well, we got halfway there, sort of, and then we made a mess of a few other things.
Yeah, and this actually happened because, this is one of those things where elements interacting on the page can do bad things. So right now, basically what happened is our hero block said, oh wait, if you want to put it there and these are next to each other and this text is here, then this element is actually going to be too big to fit in our box. So basically it floated it here and then it sort of stranded it outside of the box. There's a pretty good way of just making sure everything that you want inside of the box stays in there, and that's using the overflow property. So if elements sort of overflow from that div, the div will just simply enlarge itself to account for it, instead of simply saying, well, I guess you're out there on your own. So I'm going to say overflow auto, and that should take care of that.
Okay, so that'll automatically resize.
Exactly. Okay. So basically, it'll say if an element overflows our div, don't just leave it hanging. Bring it back in. We'll enlarge ourselves to keep it in here.
Okay. One of my favorite little tricks to do with the overflow is to use that scroll. So that way, rather than having to use iframes, you can just set up the div tag. It's got that huge block of text, and you just want scrollability inside of there. If you set that overflow to scroll, it'll automatically just put in a scroll bar inside of there, which is I think a neat little trick.
Yeah, exactly. So you can have a little text box with a scroll bar next to it, instead of having a huge chunk of text that would take up the entire page.
Exactly.
So I see this happening all the time. Like when you're buying new software, they're getting you to sign the terms and conditions. That's just they could be using an iframe, but most likely it's going to be an overflow scroll.
Exactly. Yep.
Yeah. And now
those terms and conditions that everybody reads from start to finish.
Oh, I definitely do.
Yeah.
So one thing that I promised you guys I would do that I haven't yet done is I haven't fixed this sort of margin here that's happening with basically in the entire body of the document, and that's because body actually has some default padding and margin on it, and this actually does vary a little bit between browser to browser, but I don't know that I would ever want some space there. So generally what I do is I set margin of the body to just be 0. I want it to take up the entire screen, and I also want there to be no padding. So, elements within the body just, go from side to side exactly where I would expect it.
Okay.
And once I save that,
that does sort of make sense. I mean, that's the screen where it's displaying. Just give me the entire screen.
Yeah. Why would I want blank space there? I don't understand. This is just across every browser essentially. But now that we've updated that, you'll see that it's now smooth here again. And the last thing that we want to do with padding is we actually want to pad probably each of these links. So it's not just one chunk of text together, but they actually have some padding left and right. And you can set padding for things for even inline elements if they're not only for block elements. So I'm going to go back in here, and you'll see I did this the descendant selector like we learned before for all, because all the list items within our header are going to be links. Link outs. So I just set it there instead. And what I'm going to do here is I'm going to do just some padding to the right. I'm going to set that to 20 pixels just to give it a little bit of padding. I'm not going to do left and right because, all of them just can go 20 over.
Yeah, that would combine, and now you've got 40 pixels.
Yeah, exactly. And this is just much more exact. I don't want to have to divide it by half. And you'll see that now this is separated a little bit more. But now we also want these to be on the center of the page. I mean, everything else is sort of centered. It's nice to have things centered. And actually what is interesting is that centering can, once you have inline elements, centering can happen to basically all of them. So we can center all of these links here, and we can center these inline block cards on boxes on the bottom using the same thing. And it's going to be text align. So I know that the boxes on the bottom aren't text, but that is how you indeed align them to be more centered.
So it's sort of like the reverse of the old color, where color is just for the text. Here you actually want to apply it to the element, and you're going to use text as the prefix.
Yeah, this is just a simple way to center your inline elements. There are other ways as well. People set the margins, but I find this to be fairly straightforward. So I'm going to set this. So I'm going to set the block. I'm setting the text align center not to the boxes themselves, but to the container of the boxes. So that everything that goes inside that container, which are all the boxes, are automatically centered. So I'm going to set that to here, and then similarly, I'm not going to set these, the header list items to be text align centered.
The entire header.
Yeah, exactly. I'm going to set the entire header to be text align.
And while Helen's typing this out, one of the things that's worth noting is with the IntelliSense inside of Visual Studio is it will pick up if you happen to type in the middle of something. So if you forget that it's text align, if you just type align, text align will still show up in the IntelliSense, which is really nice.
Yeah, that's very useful. Because you might not always remember that it's text align to align some elements. So once we have that, now if we just refresh the page, you'll see that these elements on top in the header are, of course, aligned, but in the center. But also these are centered as well on the bottom. So now, once we minimize the page, I mean, they're always going to be sort of centered. They're not going to look very good, unfortunately, because as you can see, we still have sort of this off-kilter alignment there. And that's because we haven't actually told inline elements how to align themselves. You can so what we're going to do is we're actually going to say, okay, all of these elements in this box, or all of these elements, align yourselves according to the top. So basically, all you guys should start at the same top edge. So we're going to go in here, and then for each of these boxes, we're going to say top align. Top. Well, let's see.
Vertical.
Vertical, yes. Vertical align. We're going to set vertical align to top. That's where I mix myself up. So once I set my vertical align to top, once we refresh this, you'll see that they're on the same row, which is great, except now they're kind of touching the hero block. And all that we need to do for that is we basically need to set some margin for the container that these boxes are going to be in. So if we go back here in the modules block, next to text or under text align centered, we just basically need to give this some margin. We'll just go margin top, 50 pixels or so. And once we jump back here and we refresh the page, we'll see that it has some margin here.
Okay, perfect.
So now this, is already looking basically like this. You'll see that all of these boxes are text aligned on top, but because we set the sizes of all the boxes, they're still the same size. It's not pushed down a little bit because we said all of these boxes would be exact squares.
Mm-hmm.
So I hope that gives you a little bit of flavor of how to position all of these different elements onto the page. This is not, for the record, how I would recommend you build your own web page. I would definitely say you should put much more styling onto these pages.
Of course.
Or you can go for a framework like Bootstrap,
mm-hmm.
which actually does a lot of the centering, the pulling elements left and right for you as classes that you can call. And I think it's much cleaner.
Yeah.
Much cleaner than what we're doing here.
Yep.
But what I hope to show is how you can position those elements on your own, or
mm-hmm.
how you can modify the positioning of elements within Bootstrap if you're using something like that, or using another CSS framework.
And I really liked how you kind of started with just sort of, hey, here's a clean slate and everything kind of a mess, and add in a couple little properties, and then, okay, now I've got this here, I've got this here, I've got this here. And that really is sort of the typical development with CSS, is you'll go in, you'll add something, let's see how it looks, go in, add something, let's see how it looks, and kind of build that iteratively, that step by step. So
yeah.
I really dig that.
Yeah, I find that if you add too many properties at the same time in CSS, you just go in, it's a mess, and then you have to open your developer tools anyway to look at which properties should not be affecting it.
Exactly. Perfect. All right, well, are you hungry?
A little bit, yeah, I'm getting there.
All right, I'm hungry. What do you say we take a meal break and we'll come on back in about an hour? Sound good?
Sounds good.
All right, we'll see you guys in about an hour.
Bye.